Book 1, Chapter 7 of The Clansman, an historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan by Thomas Dixon, Jr. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recorded by Michelle Fry. Chapter 7, The Frenzy of a Nation. Phil hurried through the excited crowds with Margaret and Elsie, left them at the hospital door, and ran to the War Department to report for duty. Already the tramp of regiments echoed down every great avenue. Even as he ran, his heart beat with a strange new stroke when he recalled the look of appeal in Margaret's dark eyes as she nestled close to his side and clung to his arm for protection. He remembered with a smile the almost resistless impulse of a moment to slip his arm around her and assure her of safety, if he had only dared. Elsie begged Mrs. Cameron and Margaret to go home with her until the city was quiet. "No," said the mother, "I'm afraid not. Death has no terrors for me any longer. We will not leave Ben a moment now, day or night. My soul is sick with dread for what this awful tragedy will mean for the South. I can't think of my own safety. Can anyone undo this pardon now?" she asked anxiously. "I am sure they cannot. The name on that paper should be mightier dead than living." "Ah, but will it be? Do you know Mr. Johnson? Can he control Stanton? He seemed to be more powerful than the president himself. What will that man do now with those who fall into his hands?" "He can do nothing with your son, rest assured." "I wish I knew it," said the mother wistfully. A few moments after the president died on Saturday morning, the rain began to pour in torrents. The flags that flew from 1,000 gilt-tipped peaks in celebration of victory drooped to half-mast and hung weeping around their staffs. The litter of burnt fireworks, limp and crumbling, strewed the streets, and the tricolored lanterns and balloons, hanging pathetically from their wires, began to fall to pieces. Never in all the history of man had such a conjunction of events befallen a nation, from the heights of heaven's rejoicing to be suddenly hurled to the depths of hell in piteous, helpless grief. Noon to midnight, without a moment between, a pall of voiceless horror spread its shadows over the land. Nothing short of an earthquake or the sound of the archangel's trumpet could have produced the sense of helpless consternation, the black and speechless despair. The people read their papers in tears. The morning meal was untouched. By no other single feat could death have carried such peculiar horror to every home. Around this giant figure the heartstrings of the people had been unconsciously knit. Even his political enemies had come to love him. Above all, in just this moment he was the incarnation of the triumphant Union, on the altar of whose life every house had laid the offering of its firstborn. The tragedy was stupefying. It was unthinkable. It was the mockery of fate. Men walked the streets of the cities, dazed with a sense of blind grief. Every note of music and rejoicing became a dirge. All business ceased. Every wheel in every mill stopped. The roar of the great city was hushed, and greed, for a moment, forgot his cunning. The army only moved with swifter spring, tightening its mighty grip on the throat of the bleeding, prostrate South. As the day wore on its gloomy hours, and men began to find speech, they spoke to each other at first in low tones, of fate, of life, of death, of immortality, of God. And then, as grief found words, the measureless rage of baffled strength grew slowly to madness. On every breeze from the north came the deep muttered curses. Easter Sunday dawned after the storm, clear and beautiful in a flood of glorious sunshine. The churches were thronged as never in their history. All had been decorated for the double celebration of Easter and the triumph of the Union. The preachers had prepared sermons pitched in the highest anthem key of victory, victory over death and the grave of Calvary, and victory for the nation, opening a future of boundless glory. The churches were labyrinths of flowers, and around every pulpit and from every Gothic arch hung the red, white, and blue flags of the Republic. And now, as if to mock this gorgeous pageant, Death had in the night flung a black mantle over every flag and wound a strangling web of crape round every Easter flower. When the preachers faced the silent crowds before them, looking into the faces of fathers, mothers, brothers, sisters, and lovers whose dear ones had been slain in battle or died in prison pens, the tide of grief and rage rose and swept them from their feet. The Easter sermon was laid aside. 50,000 Christian ministers, stunned and crazed by insane passion, standing before the altars of God, hurled into the broken hearts before them the wildest cries of vengeance, cries incoherent, chaotic, unreasoning, blind in their awful fury. The pulpits of New York and Brooklyn led in the madness. Next morning, old Stoneman read his paper with a cold smile playing about his big stern mouth, while his furrowed brow flushed with triumph, as again and again he exclaimed, "At last! At last!" Even Beecher, who had just spoken his generous words at Fort Sumter, declared, quote, "Never while time lasts, while heaven lasts, while hell rocks and groans, will it be forgotten that slavery, by its minions, slew him, and slaying him made manifest its whole nature. A man cannot be bred in its tainted air. I shall find saints in hell sooner than I shall find true manhood under its accursed influences. The breeding ground of such monsters must be utterly and forever destroyed." End quote. Dr. Stephen Tying said, quote, "The leaders of this rebellion deserve no pity from any human being. Now let them go. Some other land must be their home. Their property is justly forfeited to the nation they have attempted to destroy." End quote. In big, black-faced type stood Dr. Charles S. Robinson's bitter words, quote, "This is the earliest reply which chivalry makes to our forbearance. Talk to me no more of the same race, of the same blood. He is no brother of mine, and of no race of mine, who crowns the barbarism of treason with the murder of an unarmed husband in the sight of his wife. On the villains who led this rebellion let justice fall swift and relentless. Death to every traitor of the South. Pursue them one by one. Let every door be closed upon them, and judgment follow swift and implacable as death." End quote. Dr. Theodore Cuyler exclaimed, "This is no time to talk of leniency and conciliation. I say before God, make no terms with rebellion short of extinction. Booth, wielding the assassin's weapon, is but the embodiment of the bowie knife barbarism of a slave-holding oligarchy." End quote. Dr. J.P. Thompson said, quote, "Blot every Southern state from the map. Strip every rebel of property and citizenship, and send them into exile beggared and infamous outcasts." End quote. Bishop Littlejohn, in his impassioned appeal, declared, quote, "The deed is worthy of the Southern cause, which was conceived in sin, brought forth in iniquity, and consummated in crime. This murderous hand is the same hand which lashed the slave's bared back, struck down New England's senator for daring to speak, lifted the torch of rebellion, slaughtered in cold blood its thousands, and starved our helpless prisoners. Its end is not martyrdom, but dishonor." End quote. Bishop Simpson said, quote, "Let every man who was a member of Congress and aided this rebellion be brought to speedy punishment. Let every officer educated at public expense who turned his sword against his country be doomed to a traitor's death." End quote. With the last note of this wild music lingering in the old commoner's soul, he sat as if dreaming, laughing cynically, turned to the brown woman and said, quote, "My speeches have not been lost after all. Prepare dinner for 6. My cabinet will meet here tonight." End quote. While the press was re-echoing these sermons, gathering strength as they were caught and repeated in every town, village, and hamlet in the North, the funeral procession started westward. It passed in grandeur through the great cities on its journey of 1,600 miles to the tomb. By day, by night, by dawn, by sunlight, by twilight, and lit by solemn torches, millions of silent men and women looked on his dead face. Around the person of this tall, lonely man, rugged yet full of somber dignity and spiritual beauty, The thoughts, hopes, dreams, and ideals of the people had gathered in 4 years of agony and death, until they had come to feel their own hearts beat in his breast and their own life throb in his life. The assassin's bullet had crashed into their own brains and torn their souls and bodies asunder. The masses were swept from their moorings and reason destroyed. All historic perspective was lost. Our first assassination, there was no precedent for comparison. It had been over 200 years in the world's history since the last murder of a great ruler, when William of Orange fell. On the day set for the public funeral, 20 million people bowed at the same hour. When the procession reached New York, the streets were lined with 1 million people. Not a sound could be heard save the tramp of soldiers' feet and the muffled cry of the dirge. Though on every foot of earth stood a human being, the silence of the desert and of death. The nation's living heroes rode in that procession and passed without a sign from the people. 4 years ago he drove down Broadway as president-elect, unnoticed and with soldiers in disguise attending him lest the mob should stone him. Today, at the mention of his name in the churches, the preachers' voices in prayer wavered and broke into silence, while strong men among the crowd burst into sobs. Flags flew at half-mast from their steeples, and their bells tolled in grief. Every house that flew but yesterday its banner of victory was shrouded in mourning. The flags and pennants of 1,000 ships in the harbor drooped at half-mast, and from every staff in the city streamed across the sky the black mists of crape, like strange meteors in the troubled heavens. For 3 days every theater, school, court, bank, shop, and mill was closed, and with muttered curses men looked southward. Across Broadway, the cortege passed under a huge transparency on which appeared the words, "A nation bowed in grief will rise in might to exterminate the leaders of this accursed rebellion." Farther along swung the black-draped banner, "Justice to traitors is mercy to the people." Another flapped its grim message, "The barbarism of slavery. Can barbarism go further?" Across the 9th Regiment Armory, in gigantic letters, were the words, "Time for weeping, but vengeance is not sleeping." When the procession reached Buffalo, the house of Millard Fillmore was mobbed because the ex-president, stricken on a bed of illness, had neglected to drape his house in mourning. The procession passed to Springfield through miles of bowed heads, dumb with grief. The plow stopped in the furrow, the smith dropped his hammer, the carpenter his plane, the merchant closed his door, the clink of coin ceased, and over all hung brooding silence with low muttered curses, fierce and incoherent. No man who walked the earth ever passed to his tomb through such a storm of human tears. The pageants of Alexander, Caesar, and Wellington were tinsel to this. Nor did the spirit of Napoleon, the Corsican lieutenant of artillery who once presided over a congress of kings whom he had conquered, look down on its like even in France. And now that its pomp was done and its memory but bitterness and ashes, but one man knew exactly what he wanted and what he meant to do. Others were stunned by the blow, but the cold eyes of the great commoner, leader of leaders, sparkled, and his grim lips smiled. From him not a word of praise or fawning sorrow for the dead. Whatever he might be, he was not a liar. When he hated, he hated. The drooping flags, the city's black shrouds, processions, torches, silent seas of faces and bared heads, the dirges and the bells, the dim-lit churches, wailing organs, fierce invectives from the altar, and the perfume of flowers piled in heaps by silent hearts. To all these was he heir. And more, the fierce unwritten, unspoken, and unspeakable horrors of the war itself, its passions, its cruelties, its hideous crimes and sufferings, the wailing of its women, the graves of its men. All these now were his. The new president bowed to the storm. In one breath he promised to fulfill the plans of Lincoln. In the next he too breathed threats of vengeance. The edict went forth for the arrest of General Lee. Would Grant, the commanding general of the army, dare protest? There were those who said that if Lee were arrested and Grant's plighted words at Appomattox smirched, the silent soldier would not only protest, but draw his sword, if need be, to defend his honor and the honor of the nation. Yet, would he dare? It remained to be seen. The jails were now packed with Southern men taken unarmed from their homes. The old Capitol prison was full, and every cell of every graded building in the city, and they were filling the rooms of the Capitol itself. Margaret, hurrying from the market in the early morning with her flowers, was startled to find her mother bowed in anguish over a paragraph in the morning paper. She rose and handed it to the daughter, who read, quote, Dr. Richard Cameron of South Carolina arrived in Washington and was placed in jail last night, charged with complicity in the murder of President Lincoln. It was discovered that Jeff Davis spent the night at his home in Piedmont under the pretense of needing medical attention. Beyond all doubt, Booth, the assassin, merely acted under orders from the arch traitor. May the gallows have a rich and early harvest. Margaret tremblingly wound her arms around her mother's neck. No words broke the pitiful silence, only blinding tears and broken sobs. End of Chapter 7. End of Book 1, The Assassination.